After failing to force Britain out of the war in 1940, in early 1941 Adolf Hitler turned his attention to the Soviet Union, which he always believed would be the ultimate target of his regime. He hated communism and saw the vast open spaces, grain and oil of Soviet Russia as the prize that would finally allow the German people to become masters of Europe. During the early months of 1941, while he stayed at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler planned his greatest gamble, Operation Barbarossa, the assault on the Soviet Union. German armies were steadily redeployed to the east and re-equipped for what would be their hardest campaign. On paper, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union was still Hitler's ally under the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, and Stalin was determined to keep it that way because his country was painfully unprepared for a large modern war. The Red Army, which had once been one of the largest and most technologically advanced forces in the world, had been devastated by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. Around a third of its senior officers, including many experienced commanders and staff specialists, were arrested, shot, or sent to labor camps. Beneath the surface of Soviet propaganda, there had been a catastrophic collapse of morale, initiative, and efficiency in the armed forces. As German soldiers and their allies now flooded into neighboring countries, Stalin continued to give orders that nothing should be done to provoke Hitler. Soviet border units were ordered not to fire on German reconnaissance aircraft and to ignore many clear warnings of an impending attack. Before Hitler could strike east, he wanted to secure his southern flank. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were already firm German allies, providing oil, food, and bases, but politics in the Balkans remained unstable. In March 1941, a Yugoslav government sympathetic to Germany was overthrown by pro-British officers. Next door, Greece was also leaning toward Britain and already fighting Italian forces that had invaded from Albania. On April 6, 1941, the German army invaded the Balkans. 33 German divisions backed by their allies moved into Yugoslavia and swiftly tore its defenses apart. The capital, Belgrade, was heavily bombed and surrendered on April 12. The campaign in Greece moved almost as quickly. Despite British and Commonwealth help, Greek and Allied forces were outflanked by German armor and overwhelmed by superior air power. Athens was captured in less than 3 weeks, and Allied troops were evacuated to Crete and then driven from there as well. The Balkans campaign cost Germany time and resources, but by late spring the way to the Soviet Union seemed clear and Hitler's confidence was higher than ever. Operation Barbarossa would be the largest invasion in history. More than 4 million German and Axis soldiers were deployed along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, supported by over 3,000 aircraft and thousands of artillery pieces. The plan called for 3 simultaneous thrusts. Army Group North would overrun the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. Army Group Center would smash through Belarus, advance to Smolensk, and then onto Moscow, the Soviet capital and main railway hub. Army Group South would drive into Ukraine, capture its rich farmland and coal fields, and ultimately open the road toward the Caucasus oil. Many German generals were uneasy when Hitler showed them the plan. They feared it was too ambitious, that it spread their forces too thinly and underestimated the distances and the climate of the Soviet Union. Yet none dared openly challenge the Führer, and German war games often assumed the Red Army would collapse within a few months. In reality, the Red Army was much bigger than German intelligence admitted. It had nearly 2 million men within striking distance of the western frontiers and millions more in reserve formations further east. The Soviets possessed more than 20,000 tanks, far outnumbering Germany's 6,000. Many Soviet tanks were obsolete, but some newer models, such as the T-34 and KV series, were better armored than anything the Germans had. The problem for the Soviets was not numbers, but leadership, training, logistics, and the shock of surprise. The German plan relied on superior technology, organization, and speed to encircle Soviet forces before they could fully mobilize. If this blitzkrieg failed, the fear in Berlin was that the Red Army's vast manpower and industrial base beyond the Ural Mountains would grind Germany down in a long war. Operation Barbarossa began at 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, without a formal declaration of war. The Luftwaffe struck at dawn, targeting Soviet airfields, communications hubs, and supply depots. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground in the first days of the campaign. At the same time, German ground forces crossed the River Bug and other frontier rivers along the border between German-occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. Hitler's panzer spearheads rapidly thrust deep into Soviet territory, often advancing 50 miles or more in just 2 days. Poorly coordinated Red Army counterattacks were thrown in piecemeal and were swiftly brushed aside by German armored and motorized units. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were surrounded and captured. The Luftwaffe enjoyed near total domination of the air over the battlefields, which further crippled Soviet attempts to regroup. On June 29th, just 7 days after the start of the assault, 2 major panzer thrusts met near Minsk, encircling huge pockets of Soviet troops in Belarus. As follow-up infantry divisions closed the ring, more than 300,000 prisoners were taken along with enormous quantities of equipment. Similar encirclements at Białystok, later at Smolensk and Uman, would cause further disastrous losses for the Red Army in the summer of 1941. In many of the Western Soviet republics, particularly in parts of Ukraine and the Baltic states, some local populations initially greeted the Germans as liberators from Stalinist rule, hoping for national independence. That hope would soon be disappointed as Nazi occupation policies grew brutally clear. In Moscow, the news of Hitler's betrayal and the scale of the German advance triggered a near breakdown in Stalin. For several days, he withdrew from public view, unsure whether his own colleagues would turn against him. Soviet commanders on the front received confused or contradictory orders, and some units were told not to retreat under any circumstances, which led to further encirclements. Not until July 3rd did Stalin finally address his people by radio, calling on them to defend the motherland in what soon became known as the Great Patriotic War. In Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill received the news of the German invasion of the Soviet Union with grim satisfaction. Although he had been a lifelong opponent of communism, he understood that Hitler's attack had created a new Grand Alliance. Churchill told his cabinet and then the British public that any state fighting Nazi Germany would receive British aid, and that the enemy of their enemy was now their necessary ally. From that moment, the war in Europe entered a new phase, a colossal struggle in the East that would decide the fate of Nazi Germany and of the Second World War itself. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. For Britain, this meant that it was no longer standing alone against Hitler. Winston Churchill announced that any state fighting Nazi Germany was now a friend of Britain regardless of previous political differences. The British government sent a mission to Moscow, and in July 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union signed a treaty of mutual assistance. In practice, Britain could do little in the first months except promise support and send limited aid by sea through dangerous Arctic routes, because most British forces were still fighting in North Africa and guarding the home islands. As June turned to July, the German blitzkrieg pushed rapidly into Soviet territory. In early July 1941, more than 300,000 Red Army soldiers were encircled west of Minsk by German Army Group Center. German panzer commanders, including General Heinz Guderian, urged the High Command to allow them to continue racing east. Operation Barbarossa was advancing according to plan. Within about a week, German armored spearheads reached the region of Smolensk, deep inside the Soviet Union and only a few hundred miles from Moscow. On July 22nd, German panzer formations completed another large pincer movement east of Smolensk, trapping roughly 310,000 additional Soviet troops. There was a short pause while the slower infantry and supply columns caught up, since most of the German army still moved on foot or with horse-drawn transport. After only 5 days, the rest of the forces arrived and spent 9 more days destroying pockets of resistance. Huge columns of Soviet prisoners were forced to march west into captivity. In the first months of the campaign, more than 2 million Soviet soldiers were captured, and the majority of them never returned, dying from starvation, disease, and brutal camp conditions. By late summer, Moscow lay little more than 200 miles away, and it appeared to many German officers that the Soviet capital would fall before the end of the warm season, exactly as Hitler had predicted. Yet the German advance was already facing serious problems. The Red Army, although badly battered, began to counterattack more effectively. Soviet industry was evacuating factories to the east beyond the Ural Mountains, and new divisions were being raised at a furious pace. By mid-July, Army Group South was still more than 50 miles from Kiev, the capital of Soviet Ukraine, and its progress was slower than expected. Hitler decided that Guderian's panzer group from Army Group Center should halt its advance toward Moscow and swing south to help encircle Soviet forces around Kiev. Guderian objected strongly, arguing that every lost week reduced the chance of seizing Moscow before winter. But Hitler insisted that the Soviet armies in the south had to be destroyed first. Historians now regard this diversion as one of Hitler's major strategic mistakes. At the same time, the Red Army was fielding new weapons. The Soviet Union had mobilized more than 16 million men, and among their equipment was a new medium tank, the T-34. It carried a 76mm gun, had sloped armor that was difficult to penetrate, and was faster and better across rough ground than most German tanks of the time. German crews were shocked when their standard anti-tank guns proved ineffective at normal ranges. Even so, during the rapid advance of 1941, these warning signs were often overlooked. On August 23, 1941, Guderian's panzer group began its drive to the south. Armored forces of Army Group South attacked northward. After about 3 weeks, the German pincers met east of Kiev on September 16th. 2 large Soviet fronts were encircled. Around 500,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in what became one of the largest encirclements in military history. On that same day, over 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North finally completed the encirclement of Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg. The city was cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. Hitler decided not to storm it in costly street fighting. Instead, the German and Finnish forces settled in for a long siege, aiming to starve the population into surrender. Conditions inside Leningrad soon became catastrophic. The only remaining connection with the rest of the country was across Lake Ladoga to the east. In the warm months, small boats and barges carried limited amounts of food and ammunition, nowhere near enough for a city of more than 2 million inhabitants. Starvation began to spread. In November 1941, more than 11,000 people died from hunger and related diseases. In December, the lake's surface finally froze solid enough for trucks and sledges to cross, and the famous ice road of life was opened. Rations increased slightly, but the crisis was far from over. On some days in December, more than 3,000 people died of starvation. Over the course of the siege, which lasted from 1941 until 1944, more than 500,000 civilians perished, making it one of the deadliest blockades in history. While Leningrad starved, Army Group Center prepared for the final offensive against Moscow. Guderian's panzer formations, having completed the Kiev operation, returned to the Central Front to spearhead the renewed assault. The Germans enjoyed significant advantages at the start of this offensive. At the front line, they had roughly a 2-to-1 superiority in tanks and manpower and about a 3-to-1 advantage in aircraft. The operation to seize Moscow, codenamed Typhoon, began on September 30th, 1941 with massive attacks along a broad front. Once again, German armored spearheads cut deep into Soviet lines. And by October 7th, several more Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed west of the capital. Joseph Stalin refused to abandon Moscow. He appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of the most capable Soviet commanders, to organize the defense of the city. Under his direction, the population of Moscow was mobilized. Hundreds of thousands of civilians dug trenches, anti-tank ditches, and defensive belts in concentric lines around the city. Factories in and around Moscow continued to produce weapons even as the front drew nearer. Trains evacuated government offices, archives, and some industrial equipment to the east, but Stalin himself remained in the capital to signal determination. The most powerful obstacle to the German advance, however, was not human but environmental. On October 8th, heavy autumn rains began to fall across western Russia. The unpaved roads turned into deep mud, a season the locals called Rasputitsa, the time when the roads dissolve. German tanks and trucks became bogged down in thick clay. Supply columns could barely move, and horses sank up to their bellies. Vehicles broke down in huge numbers, and fuel consumption soared. The advance slowed drastically just as German forces were still many miles from the Kremlin. This combination of Soviet resistance, logistical strain, and the onset of mud and soon after the severe Russian winter would halt Operation Typhoon at the very gates of Moscow and mark the end of Hitler's dream of a quick victory over the Soviet Union. By late October 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union had begun to slow down. Appalling autumn mud and increasingly stubborn Soviet resistance meant that Army Group Center was still around 50 miles short of Moscow. Hitler was finally paying the price for his decision earlier in the year to divert armored units toward Leningrad and Kiev instead of driving straight for the Soviet capital. In the South, Army Group South had reached the Black Sea and trapped yet more Soviet soldiers, taking another 100,000 prisoners and capturing the important city of Kharkov on October 24, 1941. But the weather was turning against them. Rains turned to frost, roads became sheets of ice, and supply lines stretched over hundreds of miles of devastated territory. The German High Command had expected the campaign to be over by the summer, and most units had no proper winter clothing. As temperatures fell well below zero, the soldiers began to suffer terribly from frostbite, disease, and failing equipment. On the Moscow front, Army Group Center launched its final push to capture the Soviet capital. By December 4th, its leading units were only about 19 miles from Red Square, and some reconnaissance patrols reported that they could see the distant golden domes of the Kremlin through the winter haze. Yet that same night, the temperature plunged again, in some sectors below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Tank engines refused to start, lubricants froze solid, and many small arms could no longer fire. Thousands of soldiers were severely frostbitten, and horses died in large numbers. On December 5th, the Germans halted the attack in front of Moscow. Winter, combined with Soviet resistance, had come to the rescue of the Red Army, although German commanders still believed that in the spring they would be able to finish the campaign. For much of the autumn of 1941, Stalin's armies reeled under the German onslaught, but the Soviet leader had another critical concern. He feared that Japan, already at war with China, might attack Soviet forces in Siberia and force him to fight a two-front war. In November, he received a crucial message from his top intelligence agent in Tokyo, stating that the Japanese had no intention of attacking the Soviet Far East in the near future. This allowed Stalin to redeploy his reserves. More than 30 divisions of fresh, well-equipped troops, including Siberian ski units and guards formations trained for winter warfare, began moving west along the Trans-Siberian Railway toward Moscow. By early December, more than 500,000 extra men, with white camouflage clothing and experience of fighting in sub-zero conditions, were in position near the capital. On December 5th, just as the Germans abandoned their attempt to seize Moscow, they were hit by a massive Soviet counteroffensive. First came a heavy artillery barrage, then waves of Soviet infantry, supported by T-34 medium tanks, crashed into the exhausted German lines. The T-34, with its wide tracks and sloped armor, performed far better in deep snow and ice than most German tanks. Stunned by the ferocity of the attack and by the appearance of fresh enemy units they had believed destroyed, German forces fell back. For the next weeks, Soviet troops drove the invaders away from Moscow, liberating dozens of towns and villages. For Hitler, who had only reluctantly agreed to halt the advance on the capital, it was a severe blow. On December 19th, he dismissed his overall commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, and took personal command of the army. Several other senior officers were removed. Hitler issued strict orders that there would be no more retreats and that German troops should hold their positions and, if necessary, die where they stood. This ruthless order helped to stabilize the front, but also condemned many units to fight in impossible conditions. Stalin, encouraged by the success of the winter counterattack, demanded further advances all along the front. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and other experienced commanders tried to warn him that the Red Army was overextended and exhausted, but Stalin insisted on continued pressure. For 4 months, bitter fighting raged around German defensive positions west of Moscow and along other sectors, with huge losses on both sides and little change in the overall line. By the beginning of 1942, Hitler faced a situation he had not expected. Instead of a quick victory in the east, he was bogged down in a vast war of attrition against an enemy that refused to give up. At the same time, events outside Europe were transforming the conflict. On December 7th, 1941, Germany's ally Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor and in Southeast Asia. In the following days, Hitler, with almost no strategic consultation, declared war on the United States, bringing another major industrial power into the struggle. As 1941 turned into 1942, he remained determined to resume the offensive in the Soviet Union. But his original plan of attacking along the entire front was no longer realistic. German economic advisors warned that fuel stocks were running dangerously low and that future campaigns would depend on secure access to oil. Hitler therefore approved a new strategy focused on the rich oil fields of the Caucasus in the south. The plan, known as Operation Blue, envisaged a powerful attack in southern Russia. Army Group A was to drive toward the Caucasus to seize the oil centers around Maykop, Grozny, and Baku, while Army Group B advanced along the River Don to protect its northern flank and push toward the Volga. In the spring and early summer of 1942, the Germans regrouped their forces in Ukraine. Straight away, they faced fierce Soviet attempts to retake Kharkov, leading to a brutal series of battles around the city. Initially, Soviet troops made some gains, but German counterattacks encircled large Soviet formations and inflicted heavy losses. These operations opened the way for the Great German Summer Offensive that would soon drive deep into southern Russia and set the stage for the later battles of Stalingrad and the Caucasus, turning the Eastern Front into the decisive theater of World War II. In the summer of 1942, the German High Command launched a new offensive on the Eastern Front aimed at seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus and cutting the Soviet Union off from its main fuel supplies. In the south, another 200,000 Soviet troops were captured and around 70,000 were killed in the same series of operations. At the same time, the Germans tightened their siege of the port of Sevastopol in Crimea. For 8 months, the defenders endured constant bombardment from heavy artillery, including a gigantic railway gun with a caliber of over 800 millimeters that could shatter concrete fortifications with a single hit. In late June 1942, Sevastopol finally fell, and the last organized Soviet resistance in Crimea was crushed. With the Black Sea flank secure, Hitler believed the way was open towards the vital oil fields of the Caucasus. On June 28th, Army Group B began forcing its way through to the River Don and advanced along its western bank, while Army Group A pushed south toward Rostov-on-Don. By July 9th, Army Group A was close to Rostov, but Soviet resistance was stiffening. At this point, Hitler began a series of strategic mistakes. As Army Group B moved along the Don, he ordered it to capture the city of Stalingrad, even though the city had no direct connection to the oil fields and was not originally the main objective of Operation Blue. The army that was supposed to shield the northern flank was suddenly given a huge additional task. 2 weeks later, Hitler interfered again. Frustrated by the slow progress in the Caucasus, he diverted most of the panzer units south into the mountains. The march on Stalingrad slowed markedly while the reinforced Army Group A raced across the Caucasus, capturing Maykop on August 9th and reaching to within about 70 miles of the Caspian Sea. The Germans found the Maykop oil installations thoroughly demolished by Soviet demolition teams, and without further reinforcements they could go no farther. The much larger oil fields near Grozny and Baku remained out of reach. Once more, Hitler shifted his focus. Angered by the slow progress of Army Group B towards Stalingrad, he ordered the armored forces back to the north. By late August, German units were within striking distance of Stalingrad on the Volga, and the assault on the city that carried the name of his main enemy, Joseph Stalin, began. It would become one of the decisive battles of World War II. On August 17th, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus and the German 6th Army crossed the Don and began their final push towards Stalingrad. 6 days later, one panzer thrust reached the Volga just north of the city, and German troops were fighting in the outer suburbs. Stalingrad was an important industrial center stretching for more than 12 miles along the west bank of the Volga. Its factories produced a large share of Soviet tractors and trucks, as well as tanks and artillery pieces. The population and remaining soldiers turned it into a fortress, helped by the delay caused when Hitler sent the panzer groups south for 2 weeks. The German plan was a frontal assault on the city supported by massive air power. One of the most prolonged and intense urban battles of the war began. Slowly, the Germans advanced street by street, with Stuka dive bombers blasting the way ahead of them. Fighting devolved into house-to-house and even room-to-room combat in smashed apartment blocks, workshops, and grain elevators. Soviet defenders used the sewers for movement and communication and the ruins above for sniping positions. Fresh Soviet formations had to cross the Volga under constant air and artillery attack, yet thousands of soldiers made it across in ferries, barges, and small boats, often at night under cover of smoke. By late September, German troops had pushed through most of the city and in places reached the riverbank itself. For Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad became an obsession, and he poured more units into the ruins. On October 4th, 1942, Paulus launched what was intended to be the final assault on central Stalingrad, with tanks leading the way, grinding over rubble and firing at point-blank range into courtyards and factory halls. One German officer later remarked that their advance could be measured in corpses rather than in meters. Despite local gains, the Sixth Army was becoming dangerously overextended, and its flanks were held not by strong German units, but by weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces spread thinly across the steppe. By mid-November, the Red Army had quietly assembled powerful reserves for a counterstroke. More than 1 million troops, around 132,000 guns and mortars, some 900 tanks, including many T-34s, and over 1,000 aircraft were concentrated around the battle area in great secrecy. On November 19th, Soviet forces of the Southwestern and Don fronts launched an offensive against the northern flank of the German position after a massive artillery bombardment. T-34 tanks and assault infantry smashed through the Romanian lines and drove rapidly west and south. The next day, a second Soviet offensive struck the weaker Axis forces holding the southern flank. Within days, the spearheads met near the town of Kalik, and the German Sixth Army, along with parts of the 4th Panzer Army and Allied units, were encircled inside and around Stalingrad. What had begun as a German attempt to seize an industrial city on the Volga now turned into a catastrophe for the Wehrmacht. Repeated attempts to break through from outside failed, and an airlift promised by Hermann Göring never brought in enough supplies. Hundreds of thousands of German and Allied soldiers faced freezing temperatures, hunger, and relentless Soviet attacks inside the pocket. In late January and early February 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army finally surrendered. Around 90,000 exhausted survivors went into captivity, and only a fraction of them would ever return home. The destruction of the Sixth Army and the failure of the Caucasus Campaign marked the end of large-scale German offensives in the east and shifted the strategic initiative permanently to the Soviet Union. In November 1942, the Red Army launched a powerful counter-offensive around Stalingrad. Soviet forces struck the exposed flanks of the German line, which were held largely by weaker Romanian and Italian units. The northern and southern spearheads advanced rapidly, and on November 23rd, they met west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was cut off in and around the ruined city. Paulus still had a chance to break out while his men and vehicles were relatively intact, but Adolf Hitler ordered him to stand fast and hold Stalingrad at all costs. Hitler accepted promises from the Luftwaffe that the pocket could be supplied from the air. German commanders on the spot knew this was unrealistic, yet the order to hold was confirmed and any retreat was forbidden. To relieve the encircled troops, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the overall German commander in the region, prepared Operation Winterstorm. On December 12, 1942, German panzer units attacked from the south in an attempt to break the Soviet ring around the city. For 2 days, they advanced with some success, but then Soviet resistance stiffened as fresh units and tanks were thrown into the fight. By December 23rd, the relief offensive had stalled roughly 30 miles from the edge of the Stalingrad pocket. Manstein urged Paulus to attempt a breakout toward his spearheads, but Paulus refused to move without Hitler's explicit permission. The request was rejected, and the moment was lost. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, coordinating Soviet operations in the area, now launched the next phase of his plan. A massive Soviet assault struck the German relief forces and drove the panzer formations back from Stalingrad. By the end of December, all realistic hope of rescuing the encircled Sixth Army had disappeared. The attempt to sustain the pocket by air turned into a disaster. The troops in Stalingrad needed around 700 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition every day simply to survive and continue fighting. Because of snow, ice, poor airfields, and growing Soviet air superiority, the transport fleet rarely delivered more than 80 tons a day. Aircraft were lost in large numbers to bad weather and to Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Inside, the pocket conditions became desperate. Frost, hunger, and disease spread while Soviet artillery and infantry pressed ever closer. About 200,000 German and Allied soldiers were trapped. On January 8, 1943, Soviet commanders offered the surrounded troops a chance to surrender, promising humane treatment. The German leadership refused. After further heavy bombardment and street fighting, Paulus was finally forced to capitulate in the southern part of the pocket on January 31, 1943. The remaining northern groups surrendered in the first days of February. More than 100,000 exhausted survivors marched into Soviet captivity, and only a few thousand of them would ever return to Germany. The Battle of Stalingrad had been one of the bloodiest struggles of the Second World War. The German side lost roughly 300,000 men, including large numbers of Allied Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian soldiers. Soviet losses were at least as high and included many thousands of civilians who had been trapped in the city. Stalingrad was the greatest catastrophe suffered by the German army up to that point, but it was not the last. After this victory, the Red Army increasingly seized the strategic initiative along the entire Eastern Front. Zhukov and other Soviet commanders now turned their attention to German Army Group A, which was still deployed far to the south in the Caucasus. Soviet troops advanced west and south of Stalingrad toward Rostov-on-the-Don, threatening to cut off all German forces in the region. By early December 1942, Soviet spearheads were within roughly 120 miles of Rostov, the key gateway from the Caucasus back into Ukraine. Faced with the danger of total encirclement, Hitler reluctantly allowed Army Group A to pull back. Over the next month, German formations carried out a difficult fighting withdrawal from the Caucasus, using rearguard actions to delay the Soviet advance, while hundreds of thousands of soldiers and vast quantities of equipment moved north and west. On January 12, 1943, Zhukov ordered another wide-ranging offensive. Soviet forces attacked along a front about 500 miles long. In many sectors, they outnumbered the German defenders by 7-1. Von Manstein organized a skillful mobile defense, counterattacking where he could and avoiding encirclement, but the pressure was enormous. By the end of February, the Red Army had liberated major cities in the region, including Kharkov and Kursk. The Soviet winter operations had dealt a crippling blow to German power in the east. Within a few months, Germany had lost around 1 million men and huge numbers of tanks, guns, and motor vehicles. The Red Army still possessed deep reserves of manpower, and its industry, relocated east of the Urals and supported by vital aid from the United States and Britain, was now producing growing quantities of modern weapons. The Germans no longer enjoyed a clear technological advantage. The T-34 medium tank, with its sloped armor and wide tracks, was superior to the standard German Panzer Mark IV in many conditions. Soviet forces also used the Katyusha multiple rocket launcher, a terrifying weapon that saturated German positions with high explosive fire and shattered infantry morale. Despite these losses, Hitler refused to abandon his dream of a decisive blow that would restore German initiative in the east. He pinned his hopes on a new summer offensive in 1943. The Soviet winter advance had created a huge bulge in the front line around the city of Kursk, projecting westward into the German positions. To Hitler, this salient looked vulnerable and inviting. He decided that German forces would concentrate their remaining panzer divisions on the shoulders of this bulge and attempt to cut it off, setting the stage for the gigantic clash of armor that would become known as the Battle of Kursk. In the summer of 1943, Adolf Hitler planned a major counterattack on the Eastern Front aimed at destroying the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. To achieve this, he relied on a new generation of German tanks designed specifically to fight the Soviet T-34. The heavy Tiger tank weighed about 55 tons, carried a powerful 88mm gun, and had thick frontal armor that was almost impervious to the standard Soviet tank guns of the time. Alongside it came the Panther, a 43-ton medium tank with a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of knocking out a T-34 at long range. These vehicles were so new that Hitler postponed the start of the operation until enough Tigers and Panthers could be produced and moved to the front. While German forces slowly assembled, the Soviet High Command studied the situation. Marshal Georgy Zhukov correctly predicted that the main German blow would fall on the Kursk salient. Soviet intelligence, including reports from an espionage network inside the German High Command, confirmed the direction of the coming assault. Zhukov ordered the construction of several deep defensive belts around the salient, with anti-tank ditches, extensive minefields, and wide zones of barbed wire. Soviet engineers prepared dug-in positions for infantry and artillery and laid hundreds of thousands of mines. At the same time, the Red Army shifted large numbers of troops, artillery, and tanks into the threatened sector, pulling units from quieter parts of the front. By the eve of the German assault, the Soviet forces around Kursk outnumbered the attackers, and they knew almost exactly when the offensive would begin. On July 5, 1943, just before the main German assault, Soviet artillery opened a massive bombardment on the German start lines in an attempt to disrupt the attack. Even so, the next morning German panzer units advanced, but this time they faced a heavily fortified enemy. The terrain in front of them was cut by obstacles and layered defenses, so there was no real chance for a rapid breakthrough of the kind achieved in 1941. In the northern sector, the Germans advanced only about 6 miles while losing roughly 25,000 men and more than 200 tanks. In the southern sector, they pushed deeper, creating a wedge about 25 miles into the Soviet lines. But the cost was severe, with around 10,000 men killed and some 350 tanks destroyed. For a brief moment, it seemed as if a breakthrough might still be possible. Zhukov then committed his armored reserves. On July 12, 1943, around 900 Soviet tanks, many of them T-34s, attacked the spearhead of the German advance near the village of Prokhorovka. Almost 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns became involved in what is often described as the largest armored clash of World War II. Soviet crews closed the distance and fought at short range among dust, smoke, and burning vehicles. After a single day of brutal combat, the Germans had lost hundreds more tanks and were forced to pull back from their most advanced positions. In the air, the battle was just as fierce. The Luftwaffe initially tried to support the German attack, but heavy Soviet anti-aircraft fire and growing numbers of Soviet fighters gradually wore down. The Soviet Air Force gained the upper hand and could then bring in large numbers of Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft to strike German armor and supply lines. By July 23rd, the Germans had been pushed back to their original lines, and any territory they had gained around Kursk had been lost again. The offensive, known to the Germans as Operation Citadel, cost them at least 50,000 casualties and well over 700 tanks, including many of the precious Tigers and Panthers that had been gathered for the attack. Strategically, the failure at Kursk was decisive. After this battle, Germany never again mounted a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Red Army seized the initiative, advanced westward through Ukraine, and ultimately carried the war into Eastern Europe and Germany itself. The Battle of Kursk marked the moment when the balance of power on the Eastern Front permanently shifted in favor of the Soviet Union, and it stands as one of the key turning points of the Second World War.